Recording in progress.
All right, good morning and welcome, or good afternoon, I should say, and welcome to the December Illinois Soybean Growers 2025 webinar. Today we're going to be talking about navigating soybean trade tariffs. And with us today we have Dr. William Ridley, from Associate Professor at the University of Illinois, who's going to be presenting. And then at the back end, we're going to have a Q&A discussion with Todd Main, Director of Market Development at Illinois Soybean Association. And with that, Bill, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to first of all thank the host of the Illinois Soybean Association for inviting me out today. I'm really pleased to be here and talking about a topic that I'm passionate about. I am a trade economist by profession, and over the last few months, I've had many opportunities to talk about what's going on in the tariff arena. Probably more opportunities than I wanted to have. So I'm going to preface my talk with a couple of caveats, a couple of disclaimers. Now, first, in the description of today's talk, there was a bit of mentions of what individual growers can do, strategies for adapting to the risk and uncertainty that's going on right now. My talk is largely a view of things at the macro level, the policy situation, how we got here, where we're likely to be headed. I'm going to try to give some perspective on what you, the individual grower, can do to adapt. But like I said, it's mostly about kind of a big picture view of things. And the second disclaimer I want to offer, that I offer every time I give a version of this talk, is that things are changing so quickly in the trade policy environment that what I share with you today is very likely to change in the next 24 hours, in the next week, in the next month. So things continue to evolve, and I don't think anybody has a really firm grasp on where exactly we're headed. So I guess just keep all of that in mind as I talk about the current state of affairs. So with that, I'm going to jump into it. Talk to you about navigating soybean tariff strategies farmers can control to manage risk and capture new markets. So let's take it away. So in my talk today, I'm going to highlight three broad themes, and I think a lot of this background will be familiar for folks, but I think it's still worth recapping exactly what has happened and how we got here. So number one, I'm going to talk about the state of affairs in terms of trade policy developments. I'm going to try not to be Mr. Doom and Gloom. I'm going to try to highlight some silver linings, although there's certainly plenty of doom and gloom to dwell on. I'm going to talk about other aspects of global soybean markets that are really relevant right now, particularly the competition that Illinois growers and that U.S. growers face from abroad, from places like Brazil. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the domestic front, market issues at home, policy issues at home. This is not my forte. This is not my expertise. So I'm largely going to focus on the trade policy situation in what I talk about today. So, background, again, I think most folks are aware of the current situation. It's that since early 2025, since February, it's been really just an onslaught, endless new trade policy announcements, tariffs on everybody, tariffs for any number of reasons. So I think one of the big ones, some of the big ones to highlight are, well, we put tariffs on our very largest trade partners, tariffs over fentanyl smuggling, tariffs over immigration concerns. There are these current reciprocal tariffs enacted under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that targeted dozens and dozens of countries. Those remain in a state of limbo because the Supreme Court is hearing about their legality right now. There's the uniform 10% tariffs on all trading partners. So it's really been hard to keep track of all of these developments. Not only have there been tariffs just across the board, there have been tariffs for different reasons. They've changed over time. They've been rescinded. They've been reimposed. So it's really just a constant state of flux. And what this has led to, as we've seen in other bouts of protectionism and trade wars and all of this, is that there was instantaneous retaliation from major trade partners. Okay. And what tariffs do fundamentally is, well, they're attacks on imports, as I think everybody knows by now. What that's led to is rising costs for things like fertilizer, things like imported equipment. Really just across the board, it's kind of a dire situation for all of these reasons, retaliation, rising input costs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we are now, okay? And as we were talking about before everybody logged on, this is in a lot of ways a replay of events that we've seen before. I think a lot of people say, "Hey, wait a minute, I've seen this movie." because in 2018, 2019, we went through almost exactly the same sequence of events. So in 2018, 2019, as folks probably remember, we had this large trade dispute with China. And right off the bat, straight away, what their strategy was to target, well, major U.S. exports, particularly major U.S. ag exports, and particularly commodities like soybeans, also other stuff like pork, like sorghum, like cotton. But I think everybody knows that soybeans were really the public enemy number one in terms of who China targeted with their tariff retaliation. And what we saw in the last bout of trade conflict, as we've seen in this current bout, is just a collapse in exports, and particularly for soybeans. And just to put a big headline number out there for you, the year over year, November to November exports down by 40% from 2025 relative to 2024. So really just I wouldn't call it a complete collapse, but really dire numbers, dire circumstances for exports, for growers, as we saw previously, as we saw in the previous round of trade conflict. And I like to highlight this article that came out earlier in the at the start of summer. And this is when these trade, like the current instance of retaliation was just firing off. I don't think anybody really knew exactly where we were headed, but I think these headlines are revealing. So this is an interview. They spoke to this guy, this soybean grower in Manhattan, Illinois. And I would point out this quote at the bottom: I am planting less corn and soybeans and as many acres of oats and wheat as I can. I think this guy saw the writing on the wall. Okay. And the quotes that I like to highlight here is that, again, nobody really knew where things were headed. So the quote from this guy was, he's optimistic. There's faith in the direction of where these things are going. It's that, these tariffs weren't just instituted for no reason, hopefully. So I think people were cautiously, I don't know if the right word is optimistic, but hopeful that, things would turn out better than they did back in 2018, 2019. On the other hand, you have pessimists, you have Chicken Littles, this guy at the University of Illinois who said, I think it's going to be a disaster for Illinois soybean growers. So has it been a disaster? Well, I don't think it's been total doomsday. I don't think it's been the apocalypse. But certainly, I don't think anybody would point to the current situation and say, this is where we as soybean growers would like to be. Okay. So, yeah, more numbers. And again, I promised I wouldn't be Mr. Doom and Gloom, but some of these things are unavoidable. So this is what U.S. China soybean exports have been doing. And I picked 2020 as kind of the starting point for this chart that I'm showing because that was kind of the termination of the first U.S. China trade war. We had this phase one deal where China committed to buying, large amounts of U.S. ag exports, soybeans among them. But what we see today and what was in the headlines all throughout the summer was that, well, number one, exports had been trailing off as the phase one deal kind of waned. Okay. But as we came into, the latter half of 2025, exports cratered. They went to zero. There were no soybean sales to China. Okay. And whereas in the months of September and October, we would typically be seeing, large volumes being shipped overseas, those volumes simply didn't materialize. And through November, as I think folks on this call are aware of, exports were just not happening at all. There's been some hope, there's been some glimmers, some silver linings. It's that shipments have resumed in limited number and in limited scope, but I think things are still in a pretty perilous situation. On balance, if we wanted to look at not just U.S. China exports, but total U.S. soybean exports, I don't think things are so grim. And these numbers here will show you that, and to be clear, these only run through September, whereas the last chart I showed you ran through November. Exports are not where they were in the aggregate, but they haven't flatlined. So there have been opportunities to diversify. What we can't sell to China, we try to sell to other places. So, obviously you'd like to, keep your largest customer. But the industry has been, somewhat resilient in the face of these trade challenges, in the face of declining prices and rising input costs and all of these things. So the situation is not it's not as doom and gloom as those other charts that I showed you, even though things are obviously not great. So where are we now? And this is what I really wanted to highlight because a lot of this, what I've shown you, up through now is kind of history, recent and not so recent. But what are the latest developments? Well, encouragingly, and I say that, with a few qualifiers attached. Encouragingly, there have been, there has been this agreement that China is going to start purchasing soybeans. Initially, this came out in November. There was this announcement that they were going to buy 12 million tons, far below the typical, baseline level of exports, but certainly better than zero. And as encouraging as that was, and as pleased as everybody was to learn of this news, more recently that's been adjusted, and no longer is the commitment to buy these beans by the end of 2025, but rather the new target is to buy them by the end of the growing season. And I put it in parentheses here that that's a bit of a difference. I'd say it's a pretty noteworthy difference. But while on one hand it's better than nothing, on the other hand, it seems to be a moving target, and nothing firm has been established yet. The anticipated commitment, the numbers that have been thrown around, and we'll see if these are actually, like put on paper and finalized. The anticipated commitment is that China is going to start buying 25 million tons of soybeans annually going forward. That's roughly in line with what they were doing in the, midst of the phase one deal. But I would highlight that that's below what export volumes typically were, prior to all the first bouts of trade wars kicked off. It's not in the slides here. I don't have it written out, but I think everybody would be keen to secure these purchase commitments. That would be better than what's going on right now. But we secured purchase commitments in the phase one deal. China agreed, okay, we're going to buy X, amounts of soybeans and other stuff. They were not so great at adhering to those commitments. So even as optimistic as I would like to be about these sorts of commitments, I'm not convinced that they're actually going to materialize, even if an agreement comes to pass. But that remains to be seen. Now, here's where I'm going to try to highlight some silver linings in other regards. It's that things are I'm pretty pessimistic about the China front. But uh, one of the purposes of these tariffs, of these trade actions, at least if you listen to the administration, is that we are trying to secure these new trade deals, these bilateral deals with these very large partners, these large potential markets. For the longest time, people have looked at countries or economies like the EU, like India, Japan, all these guys in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, Indonesia. These large untapped markets, huge populations. There's like potential there. We don't have agreements with a lot of these countries in place, but this is what the administration is trying to pursue. Okay, and agriculture is kind of at the forefront of these negotiations, trying to secure access for American products. But this is the big qualifier. Again, these negotiations remain in progress. It's not really clear what the soybean industry can expect to realize from these negotiations. A lot of the negotiations, I'll just pick on one. We have an ongoing like work in progress with the United Kingdom, and the language of that agreement has highlighted things like ethanol, market access for ethanol, access for American beef and livestock products. I have not heard a lot about access for soybeans. So that's not to say they're going to be left out in the cold in all these negotiations, but I haven't heard that much. And even if these negotiations, yield substantive results, I'm not convinced that it's going to translate into immediate, like it's not going to save our bacon from having lost these exports to China. A lot of barriers remain in place. When you talk about negotiations with the EU, with the United Kingdom, or even with India, there are these big concerns over, well, could they even absorb all the soybeans that we would like to sell them? They have these restrictions on genetically modified products in place that is a really severe barrier to access. So again, it's not clear to me that these ad hoc negotiations are going to translate into immediate gains for growers and exporters. So, setting aside these issues in the trade policy arena, simultaneously with these developments, as the U.S., as its market share position in China has waned, even prior to this latest bout of trade conflict, really what we've seen is that other countries have stepped in a big way. And Brazil has been number one in that regard. Brazil, who has, for quite a long time been the world's largest soybean grower, world's largest soybean exporter, they're doing everything in their power to take over the market share that's being lost by the U.S. industry. And that's been accomplished through, just any number of initiatives and strategies on their part. So investments in export logistics, a lot of these investments have been paid for by, by China, by Chinese state-owned enterprises. Ever increasing productivity in the Brazilian soybean sector, growing yields, Of course, like endless conversion of untapped land into soybean production, and increasing financial and trade integration with China. They've agreed to trade in their own respective currencies. No longer do they do transactions in dollars. So Brazil is doing everything it can to step into the place that, has been occupied historically by the U.S. soybean sector. But it's not only Brazil. It's not only Brazil who's stepped up in this way. Other large exporters who, they certainly lag behind the U.S. and Brazil have also kind of stepped into this gap left by the U.S. Okay. And I think this chart is going to look very similar to the charts I showed previously. The charts I was showing earlier were about U.S. to China or U.S. total soybean exports. This is U.S. to Brazil, or sorry, Brazil to China soybean exports. And it might not be so readily apparent, but these numbers just completely dwarf. They completely dwarf the numbers I showed you for U.S. China exports. And in particular, what I'll highlight in the most recent months, so these numbers run through October of 2025, is that what would have been or what typically is U.S. exports kind of ramping up in the second half of the year, that has instead been filled by Brazilian exports. So the U.S.'s loss has unambiguously been Brazil's gain throughout all of this. And I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon. I highlighted all these investments Brazil has made, all these strengthened ties that Brazil and China have achieved. So I think the U.S. Policymakers their use of trade policy, it's just been a massive unforced error. And of course, the losers in all of this, the ones footing the bill, are the growers, it's the domestic soybean sector. And I'll highlight this. I struggle to understand the logic on this one, but it's not only Brazil who stepped in. Argentina, who's historically been a distant number three in the global soybean market, for any number of reasons. I think number one is it's the way their government conducts trade policy. It's really held their sector back, held their exports back. But one of the things that the U.S. government has done is that in light of Argentina's persistent macroeconomic issues and challenges, so their central bank was running short on U.S. dollars, and U.S. dollars are needed to conduct foreign exchange, to buy goods on global markets. So one of the things that the U.S. government did was to step in and offer this bailout, this loan to Argentina's central bank. And the result of that, the implications for U.S. soybean growers, is that Argentina was able to pull back its export taxes that it maintains on soy products. Famously, Argentina has had these extremely large taxes on anybody trying to export either raw beans or soy meal or soy oil. And they were able to pull these taxes back. The reason being is that it allows them to sell more soybeans and, earn more dollars on the global market. So again, this is really, I just found this to be a puzzling development, such that not only do you have Brazil competing neck and neck with the U.S. Soybean industry, you also have Argentina getting a hand up from the U.S. government itself, to the detriment of the U.S. soybean sector. I find this to be a really puzzling development, to be honest. And to zoom out, to pull back from these questions of trade policy, these questions of competition with Brazil, with Argentina, with other guys. I wanted to highlight one thing that may or may not be on folks' radars. It's that even if these trade negotiations pan out, even if we secure a deal, something like the phase one deal back in 2020, where we achieve these purchase commitments, or China agrees we're gonna maintain stable imports of U.S. soybeans. I don't know how realistic a prospect that is, because if you've been following what's been happening in the Chinese domestic market, there's this whole package of initiatives that they're undertaking to secure self-sufficiency, to secure domestic food security. And the way they're doing that, well, on one hand, they have this stated goal to slash imports of imported soy, to reduce their dependence on soy meal for feed. Okay. So the government is actively trying to curtail their use of foreign soy. Okay. And not only that, but there's been this, like I said, multi-pronged initiative, adopting new GM seed varieties in corn and soybeans and things like that to bolster productivity. I talked about discouraging soybean meal use, reducing meat consumption. It's that the government doesn't want people eating so much meat. And if they achieve that goal, that means there's going to be less demand for feed. That means there's going to be less demand for soybeans. So across the board, these are really worrying developments. And all of this is entirely independent of the trade policy situation. It's entirely independent of the competition with Brazil's situation. And what I would like to underscore here is that, again, even with successful trade negotiations, even if these latest trade conflicts had never happened, I'm really pessimistic about the long-term prospects for China as a major export destination. Does that mean things are going to go to, collapse overnight or collapse in the next 5 years? I don't think so. But it's not as if things are going to, we're going to be exporting even more in 10 years than we were today, in light of what's happening in the Chinese market. So that was a lot of doom and gloom, and I tried to promise I wouldn't do that. So I'll try to highlight a few things on the domestic front, maybe some sources of a silver lining. Uh, there's been I think everybody's heard about this One Big Beautiful Bill Act that was passed over the summer. It had a lot of implications for farm policy, for farm support programs. One positive development is that reference prices were increased for soybeans. There were also some developments for biodiesel policy I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But what I'll highlight in terms of more recent developments, in terms of the trade policy aspect, is that there was announced this package of trade assistance, $12 billion, of which $11 billion is going to be allocated to row crop growers. Does that come close to making up for lost exports? I don't think so. I think a lot of folks would call it a drop in the bucket. I think even more folks would say, well, we'd rather just have, access to foreign markets rather than needing a bailout from the government. But I suppose it's better than nothing. So that's in the works. Payments are coming in early 2026. It's nowhere near the size of the support programs we saw under the first trade war with MFP. But I think the government sees the writing on the wall. They know that folks need a bit of assistance in this regard. So this is what's in the pipeline here. Other aspects, again, this is not where my expertise lies, but I think this is still connected to the trade policy situation. So the Big Beautiful Bill Act had some implications for biofuels policy, extensions of these tax credits for biofuel and feedstocks. And tying it all back to this trade policy discussion, there's been this growing use of imported feedstocks. I also do a lot of work on the Canadian canola sector, and they've had trade challenges of their own. And one of their safety valves has been to sell Canadian canola oil down here to the U.S. and to benefit from these tax credits. Selling canola oil as a feedstock. It's not as if these new policy developments are going to cut that off. But when you talk about things like 10% tariffs, when you talk about things like restrictions on imported feedstocks, be it used cooking oil, be it Canadian canola oil, I think that puts U.S. soybean growers and U.S. soy oil producers in a slightly more advantaged position. So does this make up for lost export markets? Certainly not. But I think it's a good thing that at least on the domestic policy front, there have been things in the works, even though I don't think it's certainly not a panacea. And after all this doom and gloom, after all the chicken little, the sky is falling, I would like to highlight that, U.S. and Illinois soybeans remain competitive. I pulled this headline from the recent news. It's that even as Brazil has kind of leapt into first place, it's not as if like the war is over, I like this headline because it shows China halts soy imports from Brazilian plants. The reason being is that they detected pesticide-treated wheat in soy cargoes. And as China is wont to do, often, they'll find imperfections or they'll find pests or something like that, and they'll just completely cut off imports. And this is one instance of them doing so. And this is Brazilian soy that they're just completely shutting off. So is this going to, save the day? Can we rely on China saying, oh no, we actually don't want to buy Brazilian soy, April Fools? I don't think so. But I do think that the U.S. and Illinois soybean sectors have a lot to offer. They remain price competitive in terms of quality. Particularly for Illinois soybeans, there's a lot to highlight in terms of, advantages over foreign product. So advantages remain. The sector is not, DOA, but policy needs to, make life easier, not make life harder. At the federal level or even at lower levels, I think effective policy needs to support market access. It needs to support exports and market development rather than creating roadblocks. I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know that this isn't the sort of thing that an individual grower can go out and act on, but I think these things are almost self-evident. What can you do? And again, this is where I kind of had to, add some disclaimers to say, there's not a lot at the micro level. I highlighted these recent policy developments at the domestic level about bolstering domestic markets. Again, this isn't something you can do. I think rather it's that if we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to export markets, we got to think about ways to make the domestic market viable, ways to make the domestic market be able to absorb all the beans that we would otherwise sell to the world. That means expanded processing capacity, expanded, supports for biodiesel production, that sort of thing. Again, this is not a lever that an individual grower can manipulate, but I think it matters in this discussion. Now, other things, obviously, market development, diversification, those are good things. I think that's been something of a saving grace under these dire circumstances. I've heard anecdotes, a former student of mine was talking about friends of his. So here we're playing a game telephone now. But some folks have started growing, non-GM beans or corn or that sort of thing. The reason being is that if you want to sell to particular markets like the European Union, this is something you have to do. They're not going to take GM product. One of the limits on that, of course, is that there's only so many places to sell GM beans, and there's other penalties associated with that sort of thing. But that's what I mean by thinking outside the box. It's that, under these serious circumstances, what else can you really do? Um, and again, this final bullet is not a lever that I think most individual folks can manipulate, but I've been really encouraged by things that the Illinois state government has done. They've undertaken these trade missions to, Mexico certainly, and I think there's been discussions with Canada. I think this is a good thing because it's putting Illinois products out there. It's that if the federal government is going to make life hard in terms of trade policy, in terms of exports, I've been really pleased that the Illinois Department of Agriculture, other parts of the government have been going out there and trying to market and secure new markets for Illinois agricultural products. I know the ISA was involved in one of these junkets, so I think this is a positive development. We'll see what sort of fruit it bears, but again, these are not so much micro level initiatives, not so much micro level strategies, but you got to do what you can. Various levels of government in terms of policy approaches. So I think that's where things stand. Um, that's all I have. I think I'm just about at about 30 minutes, so right on time. So that's my thank you and happy holidays slide. The last slide I'm supposed to show, this is a picture of yours truly. This is our QR code. Um, so Corey, did you want to take over when it comes
Yeah,
to the
100% happy to jump in, Bill. Thanks so much. Yeah, so great presentation. I think you did a lot of ground truthing and level setting for our panel discussion. And so I'm going to remind people of a few things logistically. First, the QR code in the corner, you can scan that and get your CEUs if you're interested in CEUs as a certified crop advisor at any time. Also, we're going to transition into a panel discussion. I just want to share with everyone there is a Q&A function in Zoom, and you can open up that Q&A and put any questions you have for the panelists at any time, and we'll get those answered. I see we already have several already kind of lined up. So with that, Todd, I just want to hand it off to you for a brief introduction and maybe talk a little bit about what market development does at Illinois Soybean.
should I
Thanks,
should I
Corey.
stop sharing, Corey? Or
No, can you keep it up there, Bill?
yeah, certainly. Okay.
Thanks, Corey. Welcome everyone. I'm the Director of Market Development for Illinois Soybean Association. And in addition to some of the things that Professor Ridley talked about in terms of trade and how we deal with this, is that there are a number of things that we do at ISA. One of those is, in addition to going to other countries, we actually often host, I think we hosted about 70 different folks that came through last year to learn about Illinois, learn about our farmers' production techniques and strategies, and really educate people about that. And we've really grown that over the last few years as a way to sort of develop one-on-one relationships with buyers from around the world. So that's an important piece. The second thing that we're working on is some differentiation because it is really true now, and we actually have scientific proof that Illinois soybeans are better than everywhere else in the world. And we've done analysis that shows that because of the amino acid profile and the digestibility of Illinois soy, when used in animal agriculture, animal production, you get better outcomes. And so we've got studies now in aquaculture that show that. We've got studies in poultry production that show that, and we're working on the other markets as well. So differentiation in the future is going to be really important because of our sustainability, and also just bottom line dollars and cents makes a big difference. So let me stop there, Corey. I'll throw it back to you, and we'll take some questions.
No, that's great. So yeah, definitely let's get questions in the Q&A, and that's filling up. I'm going to start off with some questions that we had people submit when they registered. And I just want to maybe off the top, maybe we can talk a little bit about tariffs, and then as it allows, shift into broader trade. One question, and we got this kind of asked multiple different ways, but I'm gonna read this one. Are tariffs really affecting our grain markets, or are outside factors that are causing slow sales and lower commodity prices? And so maybe Bill, if we can start with you and then hand it off to Todd. Are tariffs really affecting our grain markets?
Yes, and so it sounds like the question is, are tariffs the main culprit? And of course, there's always, multiple things happening at once. You can never just point to one policy or one, aspect of the market and say, oh, this is what's really important. But I would say, unequivocally, yes, tariffs are certainly impacting grain markets in a lot of different ways. Obviously the most visible way is, you put tariffs on big trade partners and they retaliate. So I think that's a pretty visible cause and effect. But I think it goes much deeper than that because you talk about tariffs on inputs. We were just talking about fertilizer countervailing duties before everybody logged on. Most recently, the president announced the prospect of we might put even larger tariffs on Canadian fertilizer imports after having pulled them back within the last month or so. So I think yes, unambiguously, and of course other things matter. Supply, demand, the usual like economists' favorite answer to this question. But they matter in many different ways in output markets and input markets, not just fertilizer, but machinery. In terms of the steel that John Deere uses to make machinery, even domestically produced equipment is going to, rely on global markets to some extent. So I think, yes, unavoidably tariffs are affecting grain markets in mostly a negative way, is my answer to that question.
Todd,
Uh,
I'd transition to you.
yeah, so I would say that I completely agree with Bill on that. But there is a little nuanced story that we can talk about, which is that it depends on who the country is, because there's some markets where countries come to us, and their big concern is food security. And soy is one of the lowest cost sources of protein that's out there. And so they are very, very concerned about the difference in prices. And so if you are a country that is making a lot of low cost manufactured goods, and you get penalized by tariffs selling into the US market, and your response is then to put tariffs on your products, well, that certainly limits your ability to buy our soybeans. And so I think when you look at it specifically, we can look at China. Clearly, the retaliatory tariffs they've put in, even with the deal that was announced recently, they've still put a 10% tariff in on U.S. soy, which makes it more expensive than Brazilian soy. And so a lot of times the devil's in the details on this stuff. Now we also have other trading partners in Southeast Asia that have reduced tariffs to zero because they want to build a better relationship trade-wise with the U.S. And so, we're exploring those markets, vigorously.
So, Todd, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit in the past, and Bill, you kind of hinted at this during your presentation, but historically, Looking at kind of historically, Todd, what are your thoughts on how the current tariff conversation, maybe broadly trade war conversation, looks now versus in the past 4 or 5 years ago? And maybe is there a different impact on Illinois farmers?
Well, I mean, I think that, if we just look at the data, the last time we went through this, we ended up losing about 20% of our market share to Brazil. And yes, the government came in and helped out people for 1 year, which was grateful, which was great, and we were grateful for that. But the next year, we still had a 20% reduction in market share. And so over time, that never came back. And we're in a situation where we're sort of repeating the cycle again. And I think it's unclear as to what the impact of market shares loss is going to be for this one. So we'll have to wait and see.
So I'll kind of, if we can narrow the focus of the conversation a little bit, we got several questions submitted that were very much around what's your take on the current trade situation with China, which I think we've talked about a little bit. But then some really specifics, like how much of the 12 billion metric tons have been purchased by China at this point. I don't know who's better to answer that question, but do one of you want to share an update on where that agreement is?
Yeah, I guess I can leap in on that one. My sense of things is that it remains very much a moving target. It's that, the U.S. government will come out and say, "Oh, we've secured an agreement. The purchases are coming by the end of 2025." But then, they never materialize, or they don't materialize to nearly the extent that was announced or planned. Somebody else will say, "Oh, what we actually meant was, the end of the growing season. What we actually meant was month X." So, I prefaced my talk by saying all of this remains in flux. It's that what I say today is probably going to be, outdated by tomorrow. I don't think anybody really knows, number one, how firm these commitments are. Number two, whether they'll ever happen. Number three, when they'll happen. My sense of things is that everything is just it's still up in the air, which I think has been the theme through all of these trade policy shenanigans.
Yeah, and I would say that the tell on this is that we hear one side of the folks that made the agreement say we're going to get X, and then the other side of the agreement has been silent, and they've not confirmed their commitments to buy the volumes that we've been talked about. So, we're again in a trust but verify kind of situation.
So maybe on that line of thought, one of the questions that we had submitted kind of live today, and this is a little bit long, so I'll read it out loud. In terms of the deadline for the agreement, USDA and Besant are saying the end of February versus Jamieson saying end of the growing season. Do you have any insight on which you believe would be more accurate, or based on pace of sales, or which is better for farmers? Todd, do you have any thoughts on that from an Illinois perspective? Or Bill, do you have a broader conversation thought on that question?
Well, I mean, I think our position is that we'd like purchases to happen sooner than later. I mean, the growing season generally runs, in the fall through, the first part of the year. And then what happens is sort of a seasonal progression, which then, Brazil and Argentina start to harvest, and then they sell their stuff, through the spring and summer. And so, we have a window where if we're going to get sales that happen, for this growing season, they've got to start happening now to amount to anything.
Bill, do you have anything to kind of add to that thought?
Yeah, and like I think Todd said something to this effect in like a couple of responses ago about trust but verify. It's that even if you have an agreement on paper, it's not clear that those sales will ever come to pass. I'll give folks another history lesson when we talk about the phase one deal, the negotiations that ended the first trade conflict. A lot of the purchase commitments that China made on paper never came to pass. There was language in the agreement that said, "We will make these purchases if market conditions allow, which is a pretty big get out of jail free card. So I remain in wait and see mode. Like Todd said, earlier is better. Brazil and Argentina have their growing seasons, and that's when their exports ramp up. But I guess I'll believe it when I see it.
So, Bill, one thing, I just transitioning a little bit. One thing that came up during your presentation, this is a question that popped up. Um, you were talking about ad hoc deals and maybe like opportunities that they could create from a trade perspective. One question, where are the best opportunities for ad hoc deals for agriculture right now?
I like that question. I think everybody would point to these, like you call them white whale markets, these massive markets that, in principle, could take the place of China. Places like India or maybe, I don't know, the EU, all those countries put together. Big time barriers remain to that. You know, the EU famously has the restrictions on GM. Let me talk about India though, because India, again, they're the white whale. They're huge. Their population is roughly the same as China's. So what are the prospects for that deal? Well, in trying to secure a deal with India, like the U.S. has tried to secure deals with other countries, we currently have, I think the current level of tariffs is something like 50%. It's that the U.S. put 50% tariffs on imports from India over other geopolitical concerns. It's not, they weren't trying to twist their arms about a trade deal, it was about other stuff. So you would point to India and say, oh, if we could only get access to the Indian market, they have these massive trade barriers and there's all this untapped potential. But at the same time, we're kind of like setting fire to any such prospects. So I would like to believe that these big markets that are out there, you know, India, the EU, maybe expanded access to Japan and Korea, even though we already have deals in place with them. It remains unclear to me what exactly the prospects are, you know, what the timeline is, what the exact commitments will be. So it's hard for me to point to a specific agreement that's being negotiated and say, oh yeah, this is what we can pin our hopes on.
No, I think that that's it's a hard question to ask, but it's good to think about new opportunities. And kind of building on that thought, maybe one question that we had submitted there, Todd, and I think this is a little bit directed at you, is what are some bright spots for Ilsoy market development? So, do you have some highlights that you could share there?
Yeah, I would say just first to add on to what Bill said is that there are the big white whale markets or the big ones that could come in a fell swoop. But the reality is that we really aren't going to find somebody in the short term to take up all of that space that China has, just because their purchases have been so large that we're just not going to do that. So rather than a strategy of trying to hit grand slams or home runs every time you come to the plate, what we've sort of approached it as is we're going to have to hit a lot of singles and a lot of doubles. And occasionally we may get a home run, but we've started a program the last few years called Soy Excellence Centers, which we're putting in these big markets to train people who work in the industries that use soy as a feedstock, either animal feed or what have you, and to train those people in how to do what they do better. And so we've put soy excellence centers in about 7 places around the country. And in the last 3 or 4 years, we've trained over 50,000 people in best practices in aquaculture, in poultry production, pork production, feed milling, et cetera, dairy. Because we know that if we train the folks in the industry in their early years about the advantages of U.S. soy that I talked about earlier, they're going to be there for the long haul. So that's something very aggressive. We just opened the India SEC, about a year and a half ago, and that's actually up and going. And now we're looking at other places like Indonesia, which is going to be the 3rd or 4th largest country in the world here in another 20 years. And then I think we're also going to have to take a hard look at Africa, because if you look at the demographic trends, and demographics are destiny, Africa is going to be a very large market, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa in Nigeria. And they've got lots of challenges there, but we've got to sort of start to grapple with that. And then I would add one more thing, which is another, sort of vision of the Illinois soy membership, our farmers, is that about 2 years ago, they challenged us to launch a soy innovation center. And what that is designed to do is to support research and development in the uses of soy in new and innovative ways at an industrial scale. So think about things like lubricants, detergents, coatings, asphalt preservation, other kinds of things. And so what we have been doing is working with Illinois universities and funding research on a very specific, focused research on ways that we can use soy in commercial products and moving forward. And we've developed our first two and have another 4 or 5 in the pipeline. And so we feel very optimistic that that's going to help us hit some singles and doubles down the road domestically, and growing forward. But in the short term, we need to sell more into the other markets. One of the highlights that I can talk about is that since we've been through this latest trade war, we have seen about a 30% increase in purchases by other countries besides China. So the low prices in the markets have started to cure themselves, and so we've been able to see some growth, not only in whole beans, but also in oil and in meal in other markets. In fact, India has turned out to be one of the biggest oil buyers in the world. Another country that's very important, that's grown a lot, is Mexico. And we started to see Egypt come back online as well.
Thanks, Todd. And you kind of did my job for me, because transitioning to questions around domestic trade opportunities. One question we had submitted online: beyond selling soybeans to different countries, where do you see the most opportunity to diversify how soybeans are used?
Well, I mean, I think the biodiesel market is obviously the biggest opportunity that we have for us. And there's a number of pieces of legislation that are going through in Washington that governs that. We're going to have some growth in Illinois because we're going to change it we went from B15 to B20, and there's some potential to go higher than that. And so we'll see some growth there as well. But that's going to be the big one. But then I think, growing these other new non-traditional sources are going to be some of them. And I can talk about a couple of them that are very good that we have in the R&D department. One of those is working with some folks at the University of Southern Illinois about developing a biodegradable waterproofing agent for textiles. So currently they use a PFAS formula, and we're working on coming up with a soy-based formula that is recyclable or biodegradable. And so that's a very exciting work in progress as well. And then the other things that we're working on are coatings and lubricants. We've got a heavy equipment lubricant that is soy-based that we're going to be able to, we think, bring to the marketplace in 2026 with the same price and performance competitive of something like red and tacky that a lot of folks use right now. But this would be biodegradable and come from Illinois soy.
Thanks, Todd. And I kind of want to stick on this kind of topic, but I'll read 2 questions that we got submitted live, and then Bill, maybe you can jump in a little bit. 2 questions, same topic area. Is there new developments domestically that use soybeans? So I don't know if biofuels qualifies as a new development, but I think, Todd, you hit a couple really really cutting edge development soybeans, Illinois soy is working on. This would eliminate the dependency on foreign purchases of soybeans. And then on a similar thought pattern, we've placed a high degree of focus and emphasis on exports, rightfully so. It would seem, however, we aren't doing enough to create and drive demand for domestic, new, and existing uses from soy. So we reduce demand from our export relationships. What impact is the checkoff having not from research and development investments? So maybe Bill, if you want to have some thoughts, and then I don't know if Todd, you want to answer that second question a little bit.
Yeah, I think any reactions I would have to that question are kind of like high level responses. I was really pleased to hear Todd's story about these new industrial uses domestically. I think that's super cool. Um, and I think the attitude, of course, should not be, well, we don't need foreign markets. Let's do things for ourselves. No, I think the attitude should be, we'll sell soybeans to anybody who will take them for whatever use. Um, so I'll just return to some of the themes I highlighted in my talk. It's that, yes, we should export. Yes, we should find new industrial uses. But fundamentally, it's about, policy approaches that maintain stable access to foreign markets. There's also, I'll hit on this question about R&D as well. I'm not going to, dwell on this. I'm kind of a biased party as somebody in academia, but we've seen a lot of hits to academic research, funding and et cetera, from big sources like USDA and others. That is exactly the opposite approach you would want to take if you're trying to encourage university research and, new industrial uses or, bolstering productivity, that sort of thing. So I think there's things we could be doing, but we're not doing now, or we're going about them in the wrong way. But again, I'll say once more that I was really pleased to learn about all these new initiatives that Todd spoke about a second ago.
Yeah,
Todd,
and
do you
Bill,
want
and I would add to that too is that the one thing that we got to keep in mind, and it's the guide or the bumper sticker slogan that we have plastered on our foreheads at the Innovation Center, and that is, at the end of the day, our job is to move the pile. And because we're the number one producer, we've got a big pile of soybeans, and so we've got to think about kind of new ways to approach this. And one of the exciting ones that I can also mention is some work we're doing with Northern Illinois University, and we are funding them to develop a soy-based plastic which can be used in packaging. And so you think of all the packaging that goes on your food products, all the plastic wrap and all that other stuff, which right now is around for 20,000 years. But if we can use soy oil to do that and have the same performance, that's going to be a much better way for us to go, and is something that has the kind of volume that is necessary to move the pile. And so that's sort of what our focus is. It limits us a little bit on the kind of things that we can approach in terms of funded research, but we've got to discipline ourselves because we've got a pretty important mission.
So, Todd, I want to dive into this one question a little bit more. At the end, they ask, what is the impact checkoff is having or not from research and development? But I think it's asking not from research and development, but other ways. And so, can you speak a little bit to what market development's doing that's not in the research and development? I'm thinking about trade missions, things like that.
Sure. Well, the checkoff program really does a great job of educating buyers from around the world about why U.S. soy is better. And there's a spectrum of activity that we do. One of the things that we're doing right now is we participate and help underwrite a national buyers conference of soybean buyers around the country, actually around the world. And that happens every August. This year it's going to be in Chicago, and we call it Soy Connects. And last year we had 700 buyers from around the world that came in for 2 or 3 days of really hands-on learning and face-to-face conversations about what we do and why our production techniques are the most effective, and produce really the best product. And that's really important to break down, not barriers as much as just people don't know and they make assumptions. And I'll tell you a quick story, and that is that we were in Indonesia recently, and we were meeting with the government agencies, one of them, which is a certification agency that supervises, all imports that come into the country to make sure that they're consistent with their social needs and religious beliefs. And they were pleased to learn that all of our soybeans are grown in the ground because they were led to believe that all of our soybeans were created in a lab and then put out into the marketplace.
So hold on, Todd. I have to pause for a second. And we're just gonna have to rewind. They were under the impression that all the soybeans in Illinois were grown in a lab.
Well, in the U.S. And it wasn't that they were not educated, because they were very smart people. It's just that they had bad information. And so we were able to show, videos that we had of our farmers out there and how they produce the soybeans, and invite these folks to come over here and tour our farms, in the summer and in the harvest season. And so the gentleman who was the head of this certification agency has contacted us recently, and he wants to come here this summer or early fall when harvest starts, so he can ride on the tractors and see the soy that comes in. And this is in Indonesia, which is the number one buyer of Illinois soy in terms of whole beans. And what we want to do is we want to open up the meal market, because they don't buy any meal from us, and we've got a lot of very competitively priced meal in the marketplace.
Sorry, I'm still pausing on the lab-grown soybeans. That was my takeaway from that, unfortunately.
Well, and again, they don't, they're just in their own country doing their own thing on the other side of the world. And so they don't, unless somebody's there to tell them differently or give them evidence or meet them and look them in the eye and tell them about the quality of U.S. soy, if, in the absence of anybody saying anything, they'll just believe whatever they believe.
Well, and I think that that's a key signal of what Illinois soybean does, is we help tell international markets what we do here in Illinois to grow soybeans. We did get one more question I want to answer live, and this kind of shifts us to a broader trade conversation. So I'll leave it open to either of you to answer, but do you feel peace agreements in the Middle East could open more grain markets? Any thoughts on peace agreements in the Middle East?
I don't think it'll hurt. I mean, peace agreements tend to facilitate trade and economic exchange, but I guess my immediate take on this is that I don't know how large a lot of the potential markets we would be looking at in the Middle East would yield for us. I don't know if we're speaking about a peace agreement between Israel and what's going on with them or what. But like Todd was saying, you got to hit singles and doubles, so any market development would help. I don't know how much it would likely move the needle for U.S. soybeans, however. That's just my kind of naive take on things.
And I would agree with you, Bill. I think that the populations in those particular countries, are pretty small. But I would say in the larger Mideast region, we have some very, very good markets. Egypt buys a lot of beans from Illinois and the U.S., and the countries along the Mediterranean in what we call the MENA region, which is the Middle East, North Africa. So think about countries like Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, etc. Those are young, growing markets with a lot of demand for protein because their cities are urbanizing, and they grow a lot of poultry, and they have a lot of consumption there, and aquaculture. And so we have been working in Egypt for the last 5 or 6 years, and they've grown actually to be in the top 5 of our buyers in the world. for whole beans. And so, there's real potential in a lot of these countries, particularly, and it's not rocket science. You think about why. The reason is they want to stabilize their populations and grow their populations. But in order to do that, they need to be food secure. And soybeans are one of the best, easiest ways for them to do that, in our various forms. And so, and we hear that over and over again from trade teams that come in and visit us every year.
So transitioning, another question that we had asked, this is another long one. So prices of soybeans are already low, but still above $10. Do you think that the reference price update to $10 will make a big difference in farmers' bottom lines? The ARC update seemed better from the Soy Midwest perspective relative to PLC, but I'm curious whether you think that either update will lift the current financial burdens on soy producers. So, Bill, I think that you made a reference to the increase, and so I think this question is kind of directed at you. What are your thoughts there?
Sure. I think, this mystery person, Alexi, raises a fair point. If prices are above $10, then what does a increase in the reference price to $10 do for us? So yeah, in the current state of affairs, it's not likely to do too much. I would highlight though that, everybody knows that prices have been like trending downwards, but with the latest developments in trade negotiations, they kind of, took a more favorable turn. However, the most latest developments in terms of, the market incorporating the news about the China negotiations not quite panning out as expected, we do see prices declining once again. Will they pass $10? I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me if they did. So I think this is a good thing if the current uncertainty persists, if these deals don't pan out the way people are hoping. So even though in the current situation it might not do too much, I think it's a good insurance policy to have if things continue to trend downwards.
All right, I appreciate that. And I know we're at the top of the hour, but we have a couple more questions coming in that I want to go ahead and hit. One question, and this kind of ties to one we got submitted online, so I'll read both. How does transportation affect our trade? And that's kind of a big question, but I will tie it with a question we got submitted ahead of time. How do investments in transportation, rail, river, ports help farmers manage trade uncertainty? Any thoughts there? How does infrastructure in Illinois benefit trade? Todd, let's go with you first. I know you have thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to understand about transportation is that it is without a doubt our competitive advantage in Illinois. Our river system, our rail system, and our highway system don't exist anywhere else in the world. And it allows us to be a reliable partner, and we can get our beans anywhere at any time, in a minimal way. And in fact, it's one of the things that separates us from Brazil, for that matter, because even with the big investments they've made in their ports and infrastructure, they're being spent a lot of time in trucks bouncing around roads in Brazil, and it affects the quality. So that's the first thing. And then I would say that transportation is something that we've got to take very seriously, because that's going to remain very important for us in the future. And so we spend quite a bit of time thinking about transportation and how do we improve everything from our lock and dam system, which was frankly built in the early part of the last century. And, it's almost a generational thing, because, our parents and a lot of us have lived on the economic opportunity that comes from that lock and dam system that was built in the 1920s and 30s. And it needs to be upgraded and expanded and replaced and modernized. And it's a generational commitment that we need to make so that our children can enjoy those same economic benefits in the future. And so we work with folks here in Illinois and also in Washington to make sure that those investments get made and that that river system remains the vital transportation artery that it is.
I'll jump in because I second everything that Todd just said about, logistics being a source of competitive advantage. Let me go back to some of the things I spoke about during my presentation about, Brazil catching up and, they have lagged behind in terms of infrastructure and, export logistics and this and that. But they are catching up. And you see headlines all the time about investments in highways, investments in ports, hundreds of millions of dollars, much of it coming from China. I think what that underscores is what Todd was saying. It's that, we can't be complacent. It's that, yes, the infrastructure is here in the US is well developed. It's efficient. It's among the best in the world. But that doesn't mean we can, just rest on our laurels. It's that, there needs to be continuing investment as other countries like Brazil catch up in that regard.
So I know we're at the top of the hour. I want to keep going here just a little bit. Todd, I just have one last question. From a farmer perspective, or maybe I'll ask this a different way. How can farmers be involved when it comes to market development, when it comes to working on these issues? Can you speak to how Illinois farmers can be involved?
Well, I mean, I think if they're interested, I would say get in contact with the folks at ISA, and we have more requests for trade teams that come through that want to visit farmers and understand how soybeans get produced than we can accommodate. And so we're always looking for new farms that we can bring people to visit and learn about the process. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is we need your voices. And I would say we need your voices to talk with your elected officials, both at the state and the federal level, and tell them how important market access issues are for our future. And, Illinois has an agriculture economy that is second to none, and it's arguably the largest one in the state. And so sometimes our elected leaders tend to forget that. And we need to remind them that it's important for our state, and we need to support the ag economy and the checkoff program that helps us do that.
So with that, I really appreciate both our panelists and Dr. Ridley for joining and presenting today. I will remind folks that first you can get a CUs by hitting the QR code on the screen. Also, as you exit, you will be asked to fill out a quick survey. This is going to help us make these webinars all the better next time. With that, I want to thank everybody, and please enjoy the rest of your holiday season.